Yo, welcome to the GingePoker Academy. Let's get started. Introduction, Richard Shields, that's me, GingePoker. I'm 29, I'm from Birmingham, the UK. I hope you can't tell from my accent. I've played poker professionally for about 5 years, longer realistically, but professionally 5 years. I've made over $1.4 million in profit playing live poker, most of that coming from Macau. Around 200k from online poker, and I've coached about 200 people. Joshua J, he's going to be the performance coach. He's 27, in the UK, but usually traveling, obviously COVID permitted. Started his first online business at 24, over 400k in sales revenue, and now focusing on helping other men build the life of their freedom they desire by helping them reach their peak performance. And we're both currently streaming on Twitch. That's probably how you guys probably found us anyway. So what to expect from this course? You're going to get a lot of information, and it's all going to be thrown at you right now. Please take a few days to think about this, maybe rewatch it, maybe note some timestamps for things you want to go back to. And obviously we'll provide you with the slides as well. We'll schedule a Q&A for a few days after you get this, and we'll explain the next steps even further on Discord, etc. Okay, so without further ado, this is our first concept. It's called first principle reasoning. I think this is a physics concept. I think it's very important to understand poker and think of it in this kind of way. So first principles is a foundational proposition or assumption that stands alone. Aristotle defined the first principle as the first basis from which a thing is known. Most recently, Elon Musk has been explaining to the world how he uses first principle approach in all of his businesses. Thinking in terms of first principles is simple, but not easy. So let's take a look. Here's Elon Musk for you now.
And then I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. So the normal way that we conduct our lives is we reason by analogy. We're doing this because it's like something else that was done, or it's like what other people are doing.
Me too type ideas.
Yeah,
Slight
iterations
yeah.
on a theme, and it's kind of mentally easier to reason by analogy rather than from first principles. But by first principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world, and what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths, and say, okay, what are we sure is true, or as sure as possible is true, and then reason up from there. That takes a lot more mental energy.
Give me an example of that. Like, what's one thing that you've done that on that you feel has worked for you?
Sure. So somebody could say, in fact, people do, that battery packs are really expensive, and that's just the way they'll always be, because that's the way they've been in the past. You're like, well, no, that's pretty dumb, because if you applied that reasoning to anything new, then you wouldn't be able to ever get to that new thing.
Right.
It's like you can't say, oh, horses. Nobody wants a car because horses are great and we're used to them and they can eat grass. And there's lots of grass all over the place, and there's no gasoline that people can buy, so people are never going to get cars.
Right.
People did say that. And for batteries, they would say, oh, it's going to cost. Historically, it's cost $600 per kilowatt hour, and so it's not going to be much better than that in the future. And you say, no, okay, well, what are the batteries made of? So first principles would be to say, okay, what are the material constituents of the batteries? What is the spot market value of the material constituents? So you can say, okay, it's got cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, and some polymers for separation, and a steel can. So break that down on a material basis and say, okay, if we bought that in the London Metal Exchange, what would each of those things cost? Like, oh, geez, it's like $80 per kilowatt hour. So clearly, you just need to think of clever ways to take those materials and combine them into the shape of a battery cell, and you can have batteries that are much, much cheaper than anyone realizes.
So I hope that's starting to make a little bit more sense. It should make it a little bit more clear as we go along and talk about it a bit more.
And then,
right, next slide. So there's some other examples of this. There's a guy called Naval Ravikant, Indian-American entrepreneur and investor. It gives examples about how to think in things such as money in terms of first principles. So he says money is something society gives you as an IOU for future favors. And a company is a collection of people working towards a common goal. So these definitions for me Firstly, help me not feel too guilty about earning money, which I think sometimes people in society do. Because if you're earning money, you're doing something for society, and society's basically saying to you, this is what you've done for society is worth. And also it helps you see that companies aren't just faceless machines, because they are just groups of people working towards a goal. They might not always get it right, but that's what they are. So some interesting ways of thinking about the world in first principles. So let's now go to poker. So poker is a game. As a professional, we want to make money playing the game. And as an amateur, we care more about the entertainment than the money. Although that doesn't mean that we want to lose. Entertainment can come in all different forms, but that's the key difference between the two people that are playing the game. Obviously, everyone in reality is going to be on some form of spectrum. And we're going to try and be as professional as possible. I don't just mean that by playing well. I mean literally by, you want to be invited to games. You want the bad players to have a good time. Even sort of the bad professionals, you kind of still want them to be like, you still kind of want to be like, all right, so you're very unlucky today, buddy. Even though you play terrible or whatever it is. So how do we make money at poker? Let's break this down. So what are the driving factors that control how much money we make when playing poker? There's only one really, and that's expected value. And we can't control how much money we make as a professional. That we know that that's our goal. We can only control our expected value. Expected value is essentially impossible to calculate. There's a lot of variables which will involve assumptions, but essentially it's a function of equity. And I'll go into both of these in a little bit more detail in a second. So let's first define our terms. So equity, this is a percentage chance your hand or range has to win versus your opponent's hand or range, assuming we get the showdown. So for example, let's say that you have pocket tens versus ace king. They're both about 50-50, right? Obviously on the flop, maybe one gets reduced to like 70%. On the turn, one's 80%. Every single percentage you can have there is equity. When we're playing flops, obviously we're playing against invisible hands. So you just got equity versus range or whatever. And obviously there's other factors like you might not always get to show down a hand, and that's where EV comes in. So EV is the amount of pot that you own after factoring in range, position, equity, and all the other factors. So you might have very good equity versus an opponent's hand, but still have a negative EV because he's got position and he's going to barrel off regardless, despite the fact that he's got a worse hand and he's going to win the pot more. So we care more about EV than we do equity, but equity is a factor when trying to calculate what our EV is. And this is really important. So go to the next slide. When we start talking about old school versus new school poker, because old school players definitely thought more in terms of equity than they did in terms of EV. And that's a thing we really need to get out of if we're still doing that. So here's an example. So before solvers, a lot of players do in terms of equity and not EV. And here's an example. Let's say the button opens and the big blind defends, and the flop is ace 7-2 rainbow and the button c bets. Now an equity player here may continue with king high. Seems reasonable, because king high versus the button open and c-bet range is probably ahead, i.e. it has more equity. But an EV player would assume that king high would not be able to hold on to the river. Obviously there's an exception to every rule, but let's just go with this for now, just to kind of really give you the example. So despite the fact that they could be ahead with king high, they'd probably call more with a hand like 8-9 suited with a backdoor flush draw, as this hand can continue on more turns and bluff, and they can still both bluff the river equally. Because I imagine you might have to turn your king high into a bluff anyway. So 8-9 suited on ace 7 deuce can continue or do something maybe on a 10 turn, on a jack turn, on a 6 turn, on a 5 turn, on a backdoor flush draw bringing card, maybe on an 8 or a 9 as well. Whereas king high, it doesn't have anywhere near as many outs that it can improve slightly on in terms of equity. So if you're just going to fold to, I would imagine, most double barrels. And we just have to sort of think about that, because if we're calling with these hands because they might be ahead, especially on the flop, we're essentially, what we're doing is bluff catching. We're bluff catching, which we should never ever be doing unless we're on the river. And we'll talk about bluff catching on the river later. But you need to be able to figure out when you're bluff catching and when you're not. So 8-9 suited here, a key piece of logic to figure this out is just thinking about, can you improve your hand? So 8-9 suited, I've already just told you a few ways it can improve, and king high, not really. Obviously, if it was ace-10, there's more ways for king high to improve, but that's why I didn't choose that board. But yeah, key thing here is to not think about equity and start thinking in terms of EV. We'll obviously drill into more examples of this. Yeah, so I'll just explain this again. So despite the fact king high is a stronger in relative hand strength, our EV could be lower by calling with his hand, opposed to worse hands which may have more equity. We have more examples of this coming up, but once you start thinking about poker in terms of EV and equity, you'll really start to have some breakthroughs. And this is going to be more obvious when we start getting to post-flop stuff and we start getting to other stuff pre-flop as well. So let's talk a little bit about GTO. I think this is something in poker that is ridiculous. So one of the stupidest things in the poker world that shows a lack of understanding across the community is what is GTO. So GTO stands for Game Theory Optimal, and it literally means the strategy that makes the most money. None of this balance or anything else. So if we're player A and we exploit player B, and then player B starts to exploit player A, and this happens for infinity until neither player can exploit the other person, that means we've reached something called the Nash equilibrium. And the Nash equilibrium is different to GTO, but most people in the poker world, when they say GTO, are referring to the Nash equilibrium. So that's the sort of colloquial definition for it. But in fact, you should be playing GTO. You should be trying to make as much money as possible. If we're starting to play games or we're starting to play Nash equilibrium strategies, we're probably not playing in the right games. So more on this. So an example, rock, paper, scissors. We can see pretty quickly that the Nash equilibrium is going to be to play 1/3 rock, 1/3 paper, 1/3 scissors, because it cannot be exploited. But if you're playing someone that's playing rock 100% of the time, the GTO solution would be to play paper 100% of the time. That's what's going to make you the most money. And you could even potentially add some context to that, and maybe you're playing in the real world, and you might want to throw paper just 75% of the time in order to not discourage him from playing his bad strategy. But it's impossible to know the exact GTO solution, but the point still remains: GTO is play to make the most money, and that will never ever change. So some of the key areas this is going to apply to poker is don't bluff a guy that doesn't fold. These sound super obvious, but these are going to be our first principles, and I have no doubt that I'll be saying these things again to you in a few weeks, but let's say them first now. Don't bluff a guy that doesn't fold. If you have a good hand, go as large as you think your opponent will call. If the guy doesn't bluff, don't call the river. So all of these are very GTO things to do, but often people get very caught up in trying to play a Nash equilibrium style strategy, which is, oh, I can't fold this, it's top of my range, and blah, blah, blah. That's all a load of crap, and we're going to forget about that now. So another cool thing about GTO, and this is more of an anecdote, separate note to the last one. So imagine you're playing a bot, and this bot is playing perfect Nash equilibrium poker, i.e. unexploitable, and you're on the river and they bet, and you're holding a bluff catcher. What is the EV of calling? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. So the EV of folding in any situation is going to be 0. The EV of calling or raising might be bigger than 0, but folding is always 0. So a bot who's trying to make you indifferent, essentially, between calling and folding, because that means he's put you in a spot where he can't be exploited, means that your bluff catcher on the river is worth 0 EV. Let that sink in for a second. Your call with your bluff catcher is always going to be worth 0. So what does that mean? So how can we make money with bluff catchers if the EV is 0? So the only way for a bluff catcher to generate more EV than 0 is if your opponent is bluffing more than what's Nash equilibrium, what the Nash equilibrium bot would do. And I can tell you now that the bot is already going to be bluffing. So think about that. Not only do your opponents have to be bluffing correctly, they have to be bluffing more than that for you to make money. So in theory, you could fold every single bluff catcher except the times when you know your opponent is going to be over bluffing, and never lose money, never lose sleep over it, and know that it's going to be fine. Maybe if they're under bluffing, you'll even make money, but literally never call with bluff catchers. Obviously not all bluff catchers are built the same. In general, you should be strongly leading towards folding them because most people don't bluff enough. You're allowed to get bluffed. Like, just don't, you're allowed to be bluffed. The only way you actually lose money is if the guy's over bluffing you folded, but literally people don't do that. So don't get confused, obviously, between a bluff catcher and when you decide to trap. And obviously some bluff catchers will have higher EV due to blocker effects. Obviously you have a range of bluff catchers, and maybe calling the ones that block some of his value and unblock some of his bluffs might have some EV, but overall the bluff catching range will have 0 EV, so maybe just call a few of the top ones. But still, the point remains, if you fold all your bluff catchers, we already know the bot isn't going to change the strategy because it's already playing perfect, and it's literally never going to make a difference. So just let that sink in. I think that's really important. All right, poker. So now we understand a bit more about first principles and GTO. Start to build up our poker knowledge from the ground up. Note, any rule or strategy I give you will always have an exception to it. A lot of strategies I give you will start off very broadly and we'll refine them as we go forward. Poker at the advanced levels is not about life-changing strategies. It's about refining the strategies that people are already using and just figuring out how to do them a little bit better than everyone else. So we'll start with pre-flop. So in order to fully solve poker, we need to be able to run a sim that can run infinite sizes and all possible sizes and all possible boards, all possible stack sizes and a myriad of other variables. Solve it all the way to the river and then back again so we can figure out exactly which hands we need to play pre-flop, which is essentially impossible. The closest we can get at the moment is monk and ranges, which I'll provide for you, and they'll be in a folder. And we'll talk you, I'm just going to talk you through them in the next few slides. First of all, the open sizes. Again, you can rewatch this and you'll have the slides as well, so don't worry about it too much. But the range I provided assumes a min raise from early position, middle position, and cutoff, 2.5 from the button, 2.75 from the small blind. Should you use these sizes? If you're playing fire and zoom, maybe, but with higher rake, raising large is going to be a better idea. And I would suggest around 2.1 to 2.2, maybe even 2.5 if you've got antes. Isolation sizes. First thing to note when considering an isolation is despite the fact there's a limp in front of you, they're still showing some indication they want to play their hand. So it's not like we can just ignore the fact that they've limped and just play a complete opening range. We have to definitely start folding some hands, but we can limp behind as well, and we can, we need to think about our isolation size. So we fold a bunch of hands we normally open, and you tend to want to have big cards in isolation pots. So like King 10 off is probably better than 6-8 suited. You can also have limp behind range. So like I just said, if 6-5 suited is not as good as King 10, maybe just limp behind, because you can manipulate pot size post slot, especially if they're bad players. And if someone else ISOs behind, for example, you limp with 6-5 suited after someone else limps, and then someone else ISOs, and then the fish calls, then you can call anyway. If the fish folds, then you can just fold, and you've lost one big blind, but you could have played a good EV spot versus the fish, so it's not the end of the world limping and folding. As for sizing, I actually ISO pretty small, which is uncommon. This avoids being hurt when you've got players that like to limp re-raise because they're not stealing as much money back from you. And it's also pretty cool when you have good hands, because if you ISO too big, people tend to not 3-bet you as much, which can be bad when you've got a good hand. So for example, if someone limps and you ISO like 5x, and then someone's only 3-betting you like good hands, and you just start to running to aces all the time. Whereas if you ISO 2.5, people are going to 3-bet their normal range, which is pretty good. And you can call 3-bets more, and nothing really changes too much, so that's good. ISOing from the blinds, obviously you want to make it a bit bigger because you've got a few more options now. So for example, in the small blind, you can just complete, and you're going to be doing that a decent amount. And the big blind, you're only going to really raise strong enough hands because you can check so much. So you probably wouldn't ISO like ace-8 off in the big blind. You just try and see the flop. Maybe ace-10 is good enough, but obviously it depends on your opponent. But just things to think about. Sizing wise, make it bigger in the blinds. 3-bet sizing, the range uses an 8.5x 3-bet size in position. This is regardless of our opponent's opening size. Contrary to a lot of thinking, a size should be based on our ranges, not our opponent's size. So a standard cutoff open ranges will show you which hands to 3-bet 8.5x. So versus a standard cutoff open, the ranges will show you which hands to 3-bet 8.5x on the button, and then that's in position. So obviously the button's in position of the cutoff. So you'd be 3-betting to 8.5 if you're in the cutoff, versus EP or MP, you'd be 3-betting to 8.5. Yeah, yada yada. Just 3-bet to 8.5. If they open to 2x, make it 8.5. If they open to 3x, make it 8.5. If you're out of position, same concept applies here, but we make it 11x from the blind when 3-betting. But I found varying my sizing to work well at the small blind, and I do it a bit more on the villain sizing. So in the big blind, I'll always go 11x, and then in the small blind, if they min raise, I'll go like 8x. If they 2.5, I'll go like 9. If they 3x, I'll go like 10. But again, if you've got antes and rake, you can change these and make them bigger, etc. Don't worry about these things too much. 4-betting and 5-betting. 4-bets are standard. I just had 14 big blinds to my opponent's 4-bet sizing. I copy this from high stakes regs, whose hands we'll go through in another video. Use the ranges provided to do all your 4-betting and 5-betting, but equally, don't jam ace-5 suiting just because the range told you to when the guy only has aces. So never stop using your brain, never stop playing poker, and really think about things. Don't go into autopilot, use your brain. All right, so now we're going to show you the charts. These charts, as I said, are solved with fire and a zoom rake. They've been rounded to the nearest 25%, which I'll explain in a minute. They've been color coded to make things really easy, and they're sold for 100 big blind poker. So obviously don't start just ripping in when you're 200 big blinds deep, and we can talk a little bit about deep stack stuff later. Alternatively, if you want to sit out when you've got 110 big blinds, that's completely fine, because if you want to just only play 100 big blind poker, a lot of people do that, and that's fine as well. All right, so under the gun RFI, which means race first in, so obviously no one else in the pot yet. This is what your under the gun range looks like. So this is just sold from, I think it's Equilabs Pro. So if there wasn't any blue on here, you just see white on this side, yellow on this side, white being offsuit, yellow being suited, and then all the blues are selected. So then it should be pretty obvious that a full square blue is 100% open. 10-9 suited here is 3/4. Jack-9 suited is 1/4. And 4s is half. So they're all rounded to 25%, and it should be pretty visually obvious which one it is. This is going to be the color code. I won't go into too much detail because you'll have this available to you, but essentially there it is. So now we'll give you an example. This is what it will look like in the folder on the right hand side here. So you just literally look at RFI cutoff and then cutoff versus various positions. So cutoff versus under the gun MP, it'll be cutoff 3-betting versus an open. Cutoff versus button, small blind and big blind, it'd be cutoff playing versus a 3-bet from those positions, because you've already then opened from the cutoff. And yeah, cold 4-bet is obviously versus MP and under the gun. It should be pretty simple to follow these. These ranges are simplified, but there's nothing to worry about in terms of EV. But blindly following these ranges would be a large mistake. There'll be plenty of times with weaker players at the table you might want to open wider. There'll be times when you 3-bet too much, you get 3-bet too much behind, so you need to tighten up. And again, don't 5-bet jam, because the charts tell you to do it with a bluff when the villain is aces. But overall, these are a very strong guide to ranges. But let's talk about how they work. So I'm just going to go through this range and explain it properly. So I'll give you all the colors first. So red is 4-bet call. So ace, ace, king. So this is cutoff versus button. So cutoff is open, button is 3-bet, and then now it's up to the cutoff. So red is 4-bet to then call a jam. Green is going to be call the 3-bet. Orange is going to be 4-bet to jam. And then the colors that you can kind of see in are hands that we would have opened that are now just going to be folded. So now they're essentially no color, so they're just folds. So we're playing against a wide range. The button's 3-betting us. Obviously, you take a look at that range if you want to. The hands in red make complete sense as get in for values. Well, to me they do. I hope they do to you as well. So ace is mandatory, get it in. Ace, king suited, yep. Jacks plus, and sometimes 10s. But then, why not use ace queen suited? That's a very good hand, right, versus a wide range. But what we want to be doing is breaking our hands into a couple of categories. So the way I like to look at this, and this is going to be very key for basically all ways of looking at poker, is red is your mandatory get in for value, given the spot. Obviously, this is a pretty wide spot. What you need to look at here, conceptually, and this is really important for breaking down how your range plays, and not overplaying certain hands and really getting a feel for what's going on in a lot of spots, is you'll see that after these red hands, you then have a batch of green hands. So you have like ace queen suited, ace jack suited, king queen suited, to an extent ace 10 suited, the rest are pocket 10s. And what you'd say about those hands is they're too strong to fold, so you're never ever dreaming of folding these hands to a 3-bet. But if you 4-bet and the person then jams, you are folding a lot of equity. So these hands fall into that category of never folding but can't 4-bet. Then that might change based on who you're playing, because if you're playing against someone that 3-bets a lot and never 5-bet jams, maybe now you want to start 4-betting these hands, which is why we have to think about it this way, because if you don't know how to adjust from this, then it doesn't make sense. You have to understand how these ranges work. The next batch of hands are your 4-bet bluffs. They're not the worst hands that you have. Like king jack suited, king 10 suited, ace queen off are not bad hands. So when you're 4-betting as a bluff, it doesn't mean that you're supposed to have a bad hand, because your hand still needs to play post flop when the guy calls. Like folding's easy, but post flop, if you're just using like 7 deuce off, for example, which you never do, which, you know, some people used to think that like maybe you should just bluff anything because it's mad because you're bluffing. Completely untrue, because again, we go back to equity, which gives us our highest EV. We then want our bluffs to have at least some chance of winning the pot when they just call. Now, the advantage of having ace queen off in a 4-bet is that on the button, if the cutoff 4-bets, they're going to jam ace king. So now on an ace high board, you're pretty confident when you've got ace queen. So it all fits together very nicely. And then what you find is you'll have another batch of green, after the orange hands, and they're going to be hands that are always call. So, for example, these pairs are probably in the always call hands. There's too strong. But then these kind of hands, like Ace 4 suited, King 6 suited, maybe some 8 7 suited, 8 6 suited, they're never 4-betting, and they're just about calling. Maybe a little bit for board coverage, maybe a little bit because the pot odds, maybe a little bit, etc. But they're just about calling, usually folding, and then you've got your always folds. So that's kind of like the 4 categories of hands you need to think about. So you've got your always getting for value, but then your next batch of hands are your next strongest hands, but they're always calls. Then your next batch of hands is then going to be kind of merged between the two, where it's like sometimes call, sometimes 4-bet. And then it's going to be your next batch of hands, which are like sometimes fold, sometimes call. Maybe with like Ace 7 suited here, sometimes fold, sometimes 4-bet, sometimes call. But there you go. So this is me basically writing down what I've just said. So mandatory, getting for value, given the spot. First wave of green, never folding, but can't call a jam, so always just call, i.e. Ace Queen suited, Ace Jack suited. Orange is decent equity with 4-bet and doesn't mind folding to a jam. Second wave of green, sometimes call or fold. Notice how we don't 4-bet trash, we use equity. These categories also apply post-flop. Also, yeah, we'll get to that later. So, have a look through the charts. When I first saw these charts, there were all sorts of things that were alien to me and now aren't so alien, so it's hard for me to say, point out where you might find a surprise. But it's very cool if you look through them all, see if you find anything surprising, let us know. Other people will have similar surprises, and it's just really cool just to get on that first page of just being honest and sort of saying where the surprises were, because that's going to indicate some of your thought process post-flop as well, which is really cool to get on top of. Cool. So let's talk about post-flop. Sims have been ran on multiple flop. Sims have been ran out on multiple flop sizes. I don't know why that sentence is there. It doesn't make any sense. The trick to post-flop is to learn very few sizes and learn to use them correctly. So it's almost, someone told me once, it's like the Doug Polk approach, where the way he would teach people would be he'd choose like 3 to 4 sizes and he'd be like, look, forget everything else. Learn these 4 sizes and just master them. And that's what he did with a lot of his guys, and Doug Polk's obviously still a very world-class player. You also see this as a Russian high-stakes player. I can't remember the guy's name. I think that's Katya. And he only has a half pot sizing on the flop, but he gets it, he nails his half pot sizing. So don't get sort of wrapped up in the minutiae of trying to find the perfect flop size in every single situation, because not only does it not make that much of a difference, especially when you start using it incorrectly, that you actually lose back the EV. But a lot of the EV that it says you have on the flop is assuming that you then play the turn and river perfectly, which is very, very, very hard. And we're only human, and the flop is probably, if you think the flop is where the tree gets the most complicated, it should be the street we play the most simple. And we probably should play the river the most complicated, if that makes any sense, and play the flop, pre-flop simply, flop simpler, and go from there really. So let me see what I wrote here. Don't get bogged down with certain sizes being higher EV than others according to a solver. In order to generate the most EV, you need to follow through by playing the turn and river perfectly. So for the sake of what we're going to start with, we're going to start with an extremely simple post-flop strategy, and we're going to refine it, and we'll get more advanced as we go forward. But we've got to start very simple. So we'll start off with 1 flop size. We will change this, but it's important for you to see how this 1 flop size then integrates into the turn and river, and then we'll go back and then we'll do it again. So 1 flop size, develop this to the river, and then come back to it. So from now on, if you're in position, IP, the aggressor you'll bet 1/3 pot always, so just 33%, 100% of the time. When you're out of position, you will check 100% of the time. Now don't forget, there's an exception to every single rule I tell you, every single strategy. There will be a spot I'm like, maybe you should see that bet this out of position, maybe you shouldn't do that in this spot, etc. But this is as general as we can get here for the sake of what we're trying to do. So the exceptions to the 33% rule are actually, there are already some, is on ace high boards, such as ace 7 deuce, or any ace high board in general, you can go 23%, and on monotone boards, i.e. the 3 flush board, you also go 23%. You can do a Pio sim and have a look at all this, and you can put in the perfect mixed strategies versus 1/3ing every single board, and the EV you lose is negligible, except on ace high boards and monotone boards, and the way you get that EV to become negligible again is to do 23. So I guarantee you, this is a really good strategy. It works at 500 zoom. Yes, we're going to advance it, but don't sort of get caught up on this. We'll move forward, but this is your strategy moving forward. Okay, so IP is easy. Let's say flop, we're out of position. We're going to play a bit more of a check call, check raise, check fold strategy, because we're going to be checking basically 100%. And we're also going to be doing a lot of checking in multi-way pots. So let's start thinking about how to play our flops out of position. We have to go back to thinking about EV and equity. Does the hand want value? Does it need protection? Does it want to realize equity? Is it close but you don't want to fold? Again, you see how these 4 categories are going to exist. So here's an example. We open 9-9 in the cutoff. The button calls. The flop is 5-7. You check and he bets. So this is a clear raise. We need protection from overcards. It's a print. For example, if he stabbed a hand like King Queen and he just folds because he's got essentially 25% equity, which we just folded and won the pot against. If he pays us with a 7, if he pays us with 8s, he pays us with a straight draw, he pays us with ace high, it's all great. Loads of good stuff can happen. Just calling just lets him realize his equity for free. And bear in mind though, once you have raised the flop, his range has narrowed significantly. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to blast off on the turn. I see a lot of people sort of get in their heads when they check raise, they're just going to keep barreling. So, I mean, I'm not saying don't barrel, but I'm saying like, you know, think about what he calls the flop with. So if the turn's a deuce, by all means go for it. Fold out his ace highs, get his calls from a 7, etc. But the turn comes a king, we can still do the same thing, but we definitely don't want to be going like 80%, probably don't want to go a third. But just really be thinking about everything as you're doing it. So a check raise bluff on this board might be a hand like 8-9 suited. It's a gut shot, maybe with a backdoor flush draw. I actually think that Pio might use the ones without the backdoor flush draws because it would like your opponent to call with a backdoor flush draw, and then we can barrel the ones that don't block backdoor flush draws on the turn. But regardless, you know, those kind of hands are decent bluffs because they don't really want to check call because they're going to have to fold the turn, whereas they can get some folds on the flop and they can barrel some turns and they can get there to the nuts. A good hand to call on this board might be a hand like ace queen. Makes complete sense because if he is stabbing too wide, plus you have that thing called equity, which is very good. When you can improve ace queen if it's got any under pair, if it's got any pair on the board. Ace queen's got outs against everything. Plus he might have a hand that gives up on the turn like king jack that's stabbed. So and I would just fold my king jacks because it's basically got no equity and no ways to improve. The turn. This is where things are going to get more fun. So assume we're in position and we bet the flop and our sizes are now 33 on the turn. The sizes that we're going to have available to us are 33%, 75%, and 150%. Firstly, this does not mean that we'd mandatory barrel all turns. We can definitely have a check as well. But if we are betting, these are the 3 sizes we have available. The most important bit of info we have though is that we haven't been check raised on the flop. So in certain spots, you could argue that your opponent has a capped range. Not always. The turn could bring in some, could change the blah, blah. It might not be a brick and might bring a flush or something. So it doesn't mean they're capped, but we're going to talk about that now. So if the board doesn't change, it's a brick on the turn, we should be using 150% sizing. Now, what is a brick? A brick is a turn that doesn't pair the board, make a flush, or make a straight. And there are 2 types of bricks, undercard bricks and overcard bricks. So on a 7 high board, anything above probably a 10, I would say, is an overcard brick. And obviously under a 7 is definitely an undercard brick, and then a bit dubious between 8 and 9, depending on how it interacts with the board, but probably brings a straight. Okay, so let's look at an example. So if we see bet 10-9-5 for a third, that turns a deuce, and we want to keep betting, we'd use 150% sizing. Makes sense, right? No flush, because I didn't put suits. No straight, and it's an undercard, clearly a brick. So what hands would we use to do that? Essentially hands with a tiny bit of equity and no showdown would be good hands to do it with. So for example, 8-7, 6-7, they've both got gut shots, straight draws, jack 8's great, are all clear over bets. Hands that are a bit less clear are king, queen, and king, jack, because they have a tiny bit of showdown. I know it's very minor, but this is really where the refinement starts to come into things. And it also has a bunch of equity versus their 10x as well, whereas 6-7 just doesn't win versus 10x, or even 9x or 5x. So making them fold 9x on the turn is great. Less great for king, queen, because it has, again, any jack, any king, any queen, maybe bluffs and ace. So it has quite a lot of stuff more it can do. So you don't need to necessarily waste your overbet on king, queen. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I'm just saying that I just need you to see the difference between the 2 hands in this particular spot. So what about for value? So same board, turns a deuce. For value, pretty clearly 5s is a great value bet. It's a set. 9s is a great set. Ace 10, jacks plus, great value bets because not blocking pairs on the board is fantastic. Ace 10's a great one. King 10, you might think that's a bit thin, but we'll talk about that a bit later. But ace 10 clearly is the nuts on this board. You can start overbetting that, and you might want to get in the habit of doing that because you want to have value when you do it. Can you have another sizing here? Yes, but by exception. Again, exception to every rules. You may want to choose a smaller sizing when you value box the board, such as 10s and 10-9. You don't always have to do that. You can still do the overbet as well. You might even want to consider checking sometimes, which would therefore be a trap. In general, when you've chosen to trap the turn, you should almost never fold the river. Again, exceptions to every rule, but if you check about 10-9 here and the river came like, I don't know, an 8, and the guy bombs, you just have to cycle. Like if he's got a straight, he's got a straight. You've chosen to trap the turn. The guy's then seeing you as cap because you're barreled. You kind of have to call. That's not quite a bluff catcher because you've chosen to trap. But yeah, that's just a bit of a minutia. And I think that's pretty clear. Okay, so 10-9-5, 33%, the turns are 6. If we keep betting, we're going to use a 75% sizing. This is because the straight's completed, so it's not a brick. This is relevant, but only for our only logic for betting should be, can I get called by worse? Ace 10 can clearly get called by all sorts, such as 9-8, 9-7, worse 10x. If we do get raised, we just get to let our hands go, and we can continue when we've got equity, such as sets and 2 pairs, and draws. So yeah, when we want to continue versus a check raise on the turn, we again just want to be thinking, can we improve our hand? So if I barrel ace 10 and I get check raised, can't improve my hand, dead versus straight, it's a fold. If I c-bet, for example, 10-8 and I get check raised, I'd rather call with 10-8 because one, I block straight, not that relevant, but I can now make a straight if I'm losing. So that's the biggest piece of relevance there, is the fact that I have equity when I'm behind, whereas ace 10 doesn't, despite the fact it's a stronger hand. Also, you keep barreling with your straight draws and all your equity and anything that wants folds. So don't just value obviously. But because the straight got there, use a 75% sizing. Okay, different example. So we see bet 8-9 deuce, the turn's a king. If we bet the turn, we can mix 150% and 33 because this is an overcard brick. You can just do this to suit your hand. So ace 9 through queen would like to go 33 because it wants to get called by hands that are worse than the king. And for example, jack 10 deuces, unblocking the board. So jack 10 wants more folds. Deuces doesn't block any of his like 2 pairs. Like if you turn like king 8 or king 9, it's fantastic for this hand. So you choose to go big. And if the turn overcard was an ace, again, we can go back to using 23% sizings on these turns. Really key to not get bogged down again in the fact that we're choosing different hands for different sizes in terms of balance, etc. Because what you ultimately should be doing, and you'll see this with Pio if you ever use it properly, is that Pio just wants you to do what your hand wants to do. It just chooses the highest EV play for your hand. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if you maximize the EV of all your hands, you're maximizing the EV of your range. So don't worry about it too much that you're choosing big sizes with these hands and small sizes with that hand. It will all work out. Okay, so betting the turn is very important. It achieves a lot of things. Denies equity, which is great for protecting your hand. Can prevent you from being bluffed on the river. Allows people to make more mistakes versus you, and no one can make a mistake versus check because they just get to see the river. So really important, if we go back, if I can go back. There we go. Is thinking about like hands like ace 9 or maybe even 9-10. Some of you guys might naturally want to check those hands on this turn. Really shouldn't probably want to do that because the king is basically an irrelevant card. Realistically, if you check back 10-9 in this turn, he just gets to realize all his equity with hands like 7-6, jack 10, any other straight draws, any 1 pairs that can draw out. And basically, he's got a bunch of equity that you're letting him have for free. Whereas you just block for a third, either he folds at equity, yay, we win money, or he calls and we get money. So either was great, and if he raises, he's probably got the best hand. So don't worry about it too much. So yeah, do a lot of blocking on the turn. Cool, so just talk through all these. So not being, so yeah, also like if you check back this turn, he's overbet. Imagine your opponent's aggressive always. So imagine you'd never bet that turn. And now imagine that every time you didn't bet that turn, he overbets in your face on the river. Because that's what's going to happen when you start moving on mistakes. Is people will spot these kind of things where you've sort of capped your range and they're going to attack you. So blocking is a way of preventing that from happening. And that's less relevant at small stakes. But as you move up, that's going to be very, very relevant. Because you're just going to get players, the high stakes players, who go, all right, this guy doesn't trap enough on the turn. He doesn't have deuces, 8s, or 9s. Maybe he has kings. But doesn't matter. I'm just going to overbet 2x pot. And what are you going to do? And you're going to be there with your 10-9, jack 9, 7-8, and go, great. I fold 100%. So this stops that from happening. Okay, now the river, very similar to the turn, but we can eliminate a few more things from the range, and so we get a few more bricks. So the logic on the river is going to be pretty much the same as the turn. If it's a brick, we go big. If not, we go large. The only difference is there are now more bricks due to action on other streets. So the example here is, if the board is ace, king, 6, and we c-bet, the turn's a deuce. You barrel 150% of the turn. The river's a 3. The 4-5 straight has come in, but 4-5 would have followed the flop. So it's basically a brick. So you want to barrel this river, we need to open again because it is basically a brick. It's not, you can't quite say it's not a brick because the straight did get there, but you have to then use the logic that went through the hand to then establish it's a brick. You can be a little bit too greedy doing that by, you know, wanting it to be a brick sometimes, but just make sure you're using your brain, be sensible. In theory world, if we get to river in this way, we'd actually be doing a lot of jamming now on the river. Maybe that's 3x pot sometimes. Because he's super capped now, and we can actually have 4-5 because we would play 4-5 exactly like this, because why wouldn't you, right? You'd see but a third like we spoke to, like we said. The turn's a deuce, we barrel 150%, standard, we get there, we'd be like, oh, don't block anything, time to go all in. And 4-5's the nuts always, aces would be the nuts always, kings would be the nuts always, 6s would be the nuts always, and we have all of them. He hasn't check raised at any point, so we would just want to go all in and abuse him. But never stop playing poker, because if the guy is not going to pay your 3x pot jam and you have a good hand, don't 3x pot jam. Go what he's going to call you. Be aware that you can 3x pot jam, and that's the right thing to do, but only do it against people that know that's the thing that you might be taking advantage of them with. So never stop playing poker, but be aware that that's the thing. Okay. So I'm just kind of saying this again. So if you have a good hand, go as large as you think you can get called. I see way too many people jam a spot when the fish would pay 80% and they get scared off by the jam. Don't be that guy. This may even mean that you use all sorts of unconventional sizes. Go for it. Like, use your imagination, use your brain. Like, I'm never going to criticize you for thinking about a spot. I might help you think about it differently, but if you're going, I think this guy's going to call this but not call this, cool. You're the one playing the game. You're the one that's got to use your judgment. Okay, if you have a bad hand, go as small as you can to make him fold, but sometimes that means you have to go all in. Like, if you're like, this guy is just going to always call this river, but I have to bluff this hand. Yeah, 3x pot jam might be the one for you. And this is really what poker is, because this is you using your judgment and figuring that out. And no one can really teach you that. That's going to be experience, but I'm just here to give you the tools to think about it in the right way. Okay, so the only other way we get to the river in position is when we check the turn. So like when we're not tripling, so we see bet the flop, check turn, and now we're on the river. When this happens, we either face a bet and decide to call or not, and if we trap the turn, maybe we raise. As for betting when check to, so assuming that it goes, we see bet the flop, check turn, and then we check the river, we generally only want to use a 33% size as standard. Of course, there's always exceptions. You can go bigger when they're going to pay you, etc. Like, never ever forget that. But ranges aren't supposed to be super strong in theory now, because you check back the turn as well, and he's checked the turn and the river. So we can start going pretty thin for value, and if we're going thin for value, we need to call worse. So in general, your sizes are going to be quite small. So just bear that in mind, standardly using 33% here, and you can do that with your bluffs as well, and just get away with very cheap bluffs. Okay, so we see bet 10, 9, 5, 33%, and the turns are 6. We check back our 8s. In theory world, the big blind should assume that most of our 10x bet the turn, so be able to value bet a 9 on the river, so, and you should be able to do that as well. So when he checks the river, this would be a reasonable value bet, and if he's a fishy station, he might find a hero. If he's an aggro spaz, he might find a check raise. So just never stop using your brain. Like, there's going to be a spot here where 8s is never a bet. There's going to be a spot here where 8s is always a bet call. There's going to be a spot here where 8s is always a bet. So I can't tell you what to do in this spot other than to be thinking about it, and these are the kind of things you need to think about. Okay, so playing out of position, and we started with a 3-up pot, just because I think it's a better example, and then we'll develop this and talk about single raise pots. So to illustrate how to play out of position, let's assume that we are in a 3-up pot as the cutoff. So we looked at that range earlier versus the button, and the board is queen 10-5, and the button c-bets. Again, going back to our 4-category approach, we we have hands that we're going to always raise for value. We're going to have hands that we're always going to call. We're going to have hands that we sometimes bluff, and then we're going to have hands that we fold. So for always for value, we have ace queen, pocket tens, pocket fives, and queen 10. I think that's pretty much all the value we can have on that board. You might even argue for some just calls with queen 10, and some king queens. Now I'll get to why some king queens later on. But some people struggle to come to terms with always check raising ace queen. So here's how to think about it. And this is going to come up in a lot of situations, this particular piece of logic. So this is essentially one of the best boards you can have for ace queen. You flop top pair, top kicker, there's no straights. Excuse me. If the board isn't good enough for you to raise your hand, when this is the best board for your hand, you shouldn't have called it pre-flop. So the logic, and that logic is going to apply in a lot of spots. But essentially, if you make your hand, whether that be a draw, so for example, if you've called for a straight and the guys then bet again, and you don't raise, then what was the point calling for you straight? Like if you like, I've seen so many people like call for flushes and then they're too scared because the guy's not going to call the river, or they don't think the guy's going to call the river thin enough, and because you just got like bottom flush. And it's like, well, if you didn't think your flush was going to be good enough when you got there, don't call for your flush, fold the turn, or whatever you got to do. But similar spot here, you've got top pair, top kicker. It's time to put some money in. Again, plenty of exceptions, but this is basically how solvers play and how we should play, because that's how it's going to work. Right. So queen 10 5 out of position, cutoff versus button. We're raising ace queen 10s and 5s, and again we only have half our pocket 10s anyway. Some king queen, we'll talk about that later. Calling always king jack, queen jack, ace 10. Again, look at that. Queen jack can improve on this board because it's going to have an 8, a 9, a king, maybe even an ace. You could say improves his hand. But ace queen can't really, I guess it can improve a little bit, but whatever. King jack, clear, just call. Doesn't want to get folded off his equity. Ace 10, again, can improve. The guy might slow down. Bluffing could be 6-5 backdoor flush draw. Folding, clearly folding 7s and 6s, despite the fact that they're stronger hands than 6-5. Because, going back to that famous word again, it's all about equity. 6-5 suited versus their value range. If they're going to call you down with, say, king jack, 7s and 6-5 are the same hand. If they're going to call you down with a pair, 6-5 suited is a better hand because it has more equity, because it has more outs. Does that make sense? 7s, if it needs to hit something, has 2 outs. 6-5 needs to hit something, has 2 5s and 3 6s. So that's 5 outs. So it's just 2.5 times better, and that should make sense. And then factor in the backdoor flush draw too. That's another 2%. Yeah, I think that should be pretty clear. All right, so let's apply those concepts to playing in the big blind now. So that's how you play out of position. Again, if you check raise, don't forget that their range is now narrow. Doesn't mean just blast off. It means play cautiously. You know, if you check raise ace queen, turns it over 5, we're probably barreling again. You can call always worse queens. If the turn's a king, we definitely need to slow down now. You know, but you got to use your judgment. You got to just really think about what ranges people have, and we're going to talk more about that as you get into these new spots. Okay, so playing at the big blind in a single raise pot, you defend ace 10, and the board is 10xx, like we just spoke about. It's time to raise. You've made your best hand. So if we go back to the early example where king 10 off on the button was an overbet on the turn, you can now see why. Because we can eliminate ace 10 from the range because they're supposed to check raise out of the flop. So now we know king 10's the nuts. So now we know it's still enough to overbet on the turn. But again, don't start playing poker. There are going to be players out there that don't check raise ace 10. So I can't tell you to overbet king 10 all the time, but I can tell you why you would versus someone that does check raise ace 10. Make sense? I hope so. All right, so let's give you some more examples in the big blind. So you defend 6s on the button. The flop is 7 deuce deuce, and they c-bet. Can you improve your hand? Not really. Does your hand need protection? Absolutely. Does he have a wide range? Yes. So the next concept is a bit of a breakthrough for some EV and equity players. If we raise 6, so this is actually like a big thing that a lot of live players I find really struggle with. So if we raise 6-6 here and never get called by a worse hand, is that a bad thing? Because some people, when they raise their hands, are like, oh, I can't raise 6s here because he never calls worse. But if you check raise 6s and he folds hands like Jack 10, King Queen, 9-8, all that kind of stuff. He's got plenty of shit hands like Ace 5, he's just going to fold, right? If he folds all that shit, not only do we deny his equity with his overcards? But we also deny his positional advantage. So he folds his position, which if he's got king queen here and he's aggressive, he's going to barrel some turns and we're going to lose. But now we don't lose that hand. Now, obviously if he calls, I'm not saying we barrel off. We're going to slow down and we're going to reassess. But if we just fold out all his air on the flop, that's fantastic. So don't be afraid of raising in spots where they're folding all their air, because that's not a bad thing. Because you're denying equity. Like, their air has equity against you. So yeah, go for it. Now, don't go crazy. Be careful, and this is where you've got to refine it a little bit. So the board is 7-4 deuce. You should be less check raise happy with sixes, because now there's loads of ways you can improve. You can improve on a 3, a 5, or an 8. So if you do a barrels with some of his air on these hands, on these boards, we're fine. So you have clear value hands such as 8-8 plus and sets and 2 pairs, and we can check raise 6-5 as a bluff. Other bluffs might be 8-9 suited with a backdoor flush draw. That makes sense to me, right? I think that should be clear. You'll check call a hand like 7-6, check raise a7, because basically any a7 is value, and 7-6 can improve, so we can start check calling a bit more. And then overcards and backdoor flush draws will be sort of your better bluffs. You probably, in generally, only really want to use suited ones, especially playing against tighter ranges. So versus the button, you'll check raise wider, so your ones with better equity. I think the worst overcard hand I would check raise on this board is Jack 10, because that's the highest overcard hand that can still make a straight. So King Queen can't make a straight on this board anymore. It's probably just a call versus a third anyway. But Jack 10 suited can make a straight with 8-9, and also can have some backdoor flush draws it can bluff off on. So that's probably the widest I go as a bluff, if that makes sense. Also, it's quite cool having Jack 10, because when they just call with a 7 and you just ping a Jack, it's great. All right, so just food for thought there. There's going to be some spots you're going to be a bit confused on with check raising, and that's fine. We'll talk about that, obviously, as you get some more hand examples. Okay, out of position on the turn. So we go through the same thought process on the turn. Do I think my hand is good enough to continue? Can I improve my hand? If you can improve your hand, usually calling. If you can't improve your hand, usually raising or folding. It's literally that simple. All right, so here's an example. We defend King Queen. The board is King 7-5. We should always be check raising King Queen here versus most where we cannot have Ace King pre. So definitely versus the button, less so versus under the gun. When trying to figure out a hand is marginal raisers night, time to use our suits. And suits, everybody, are going to be one of the biggest concepts that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to pause the video here and then we'll start again in a second. Suits. This is probably one of the most important concepts in poker. Completely underrated, I think, by most low stakes players, but here we go. Let's try to do it. It's going to be quite a few things to talk about here. So suits are one of the most important things to consider in all hands for several reasons. Like before, when we had King Queen on Queen 10-5 versus the button in a 3-bet pot, let's assume that we have King Queen of clubs and the board has no clubs, so heart, diamond, spade. The button C bets. Can we improve a hand? A little bit. Like we can hit a jack or a 9 maybe, so it's complete on the turn, so we're not like mandatory check raising this hand. But with King Queen of spades or King Queen with suits on the board, we can also improve to backdoor flush draw turns, which means we can improve quite significantly on some of these turns. Whereas King Queen of clubs unblocks his backdoor flush draws, which is great when we check raise, because if he's going to float us with hands with backdoor flush draws, he's got loads more hands that he's going to call with that are worse than our hand. So a worse hand, for example, could be Ace King of spades. That's always going to call. And he doesn't have Ace King of clubs, which is the one that he's most likely to fold because we block it. So if we check raise King Queen here 25% of the time, it seems pretty reasonable. And this is the logic for how you do it. We'll get back more into suits later, but we'll definitely come back to it. All right, 3-betting and betting. 3-bet ranges are all from the charts. Let's start with the same flop strategy. C-bet 33% or 23%, 100% of the time for now. On the turn, we'll use 75% because the stack to pot ratio will be a lot smaller. And barreling turns will become all about suits. Suits. Honestly, it's probably the most important things that we're going to talk about. Okay, so with our 33% flop strat, people will be calling you very wide on the flop with most of their backdoor flush draws. So you think about how a hand interacts with that when deciding which bluffs to barrel. So we 3-bet King Queen of spades, small blind versus button. The flop is 10 of spades, 4 of diamonds, 3 of clubs. We C-bet 33. The turn is a 7 of spades. So we've turned a flush draw. So we're always going to barrel that because we turned equity. Makes sense? turn to jack, doesn't matter what suit it is, we turn equity, it's an overcard, we're going to barrel. Make sense? The turn is a diamond or a club, i.e. the suit that we don't have and is on the board, we give up because he's going to connect with that, especially with our reverse blocker effects, more than we want him to, so it's time to give up. And if he checks back the turn, thank you for the free card, maybe we get there versus something, but it's just free equity if he checks back because we're going to fold, but whatever, we'll check folding. If the turn is a 7 of hearts, notice this is not on the board, it's time to barrel, because all his hands waiting to pick up backdoor flush draw equity have just bricked. So any backdoor spades, diamonds or clubs that he has are all now folding the turn because it's rainbow, and he's going to have to fold loads. Plus, we have reasonable equity. For example, if he calls again with like Jack 10, we still got our outs. So it's not the end of the world barreling off with his hands. Now, really important to notice, when you barrel the turn on a rainbow turn, we've just said that they're folding a lot on the turn, naturally, because all the backdoor flush draws are folding. You can't just blast off on the river because now all his natural folds are gone. So you have to be super careful on the rainbow turns, which rivers you bluff. All right. So in summary, you barrel the suits you have and the suits no one has. And they might take a few steps to sink in, but we'll try and explain a bit further. So you can do this with offsuit combos. So let's say we 3-bet king of spades, queen of clubs, small blind versus the button. The flop is 10 of spades, 4 of diamonds, 3 of clubs. We see bet 33, as always. Now on the turn, I will barrel spades, clubs, and hearts. Now the reason I'm barreling spades is because I have the king of spades. The reason I'm barreling clubs is because I have the queen of clubs. And the reason I'm barreling hearts is because there's no heart on the board. Now, on the heart turn, I'm mainly going to give up on all rivers. That's because it's the rainbow turn. And I've increased my fold equity on the turn by it being rainbow. So now my river fold equity is massively diminished. On the other hand, if the turn's a spade, so for example, if the turn's on spades and clubs, I will jam when my flush draw gets there. So example, if the turn was a spade, I barrel because they have the king of spades. The river's a spade, and now jam because they have the king of spades blocker the flushes. So that's now my bluff. And it's very hard for you to have bluffs here if you're only using king, queen of spades, i.e. your actual flushes, and king, queen off, which you don't have as many combos of, and that you're just using it with a blocker. This is a really powerful way of using finding bluffs on these rivers. So if the club gets there, the club turn, club river, we bluff. Spade turn, spade river, we bluff. Heart turn, we bluff the turn, we give up most rivers. And then if the river doesn't complete the flushes, we also give up as well, because we don't want to. You want to give up on the river when you have blockers to hands that they're going to fold. So the flush draw bricks, you want him to have a flush draw that's going to fold, which you block because you've got a blocker in your hand, so you give up on those ones. But when the flush gets there, we block him having flushes, so now we bluff. I hope that makes sense. So turn 7 of clubs, we barrel. River 2 of clubs, we jam. The same with spades. This is why we use way less offsuit combos pre-flop to make sure that we aren't overdoing it. And that will just come natural with all the ranges that we're going to use. Okay. So not having the suits is good for a reason to raise for value, because you get more chance to get called by worse. So that's what the king, queen of clubs hand example, when we didn't have the suits and we had a good hand, we wanted to raise the value. But when we're bluffing, having suits is better because you have more equity. So bluffing suits, neither of you have, is good, but narrows the ranges significantly. So we just spoke about rainbow turns. If we bluff that, great, but then we can't really bluff rivers. No. Don't overdo the suit bluffing when you have a hand with showdown. So here's an example. Again, all about refinement. Don't overdo this kind of stuff, because that's how you get too aggressive and people just start calling you down. So if you have any sort of showdown, probably hold off a little bit, but then, you know, king, queen doesn't have showdown, go for it. If you 3-bet ace, king and the flop is 7-3 deuce, you can see bet. The turns are 10 or whatever you need, whichever suit you need to barrel. It'd probably be best to check because you're still ahead of hands such as 4-5, ace-5, ace-4. Plus you have equity if he checks back like pocket sixes, and you don't really want to bet here because if he jams, you could be ahead sometimes. So it's pretty good to check the side with ace king. It actually wouldn't be the worst check raise bluff, and we'll go through some advanced hands histories in another video, because if you think about it on the turn, it actually has a bunch of equity versus pairs, and if you check raise and you're playing against a range of pairs, he's going to fold like sixes anyway, which is great. And if he does have to call with a 10, your bluff has equity. There's not many other bluffs that you can have here because 8-9 would have barreled. Ace-5 would have barreled. Ace-4 would have barreled. So Ace-King, Ace-Queen is actually not the worst bluffs on the turn here. I wouldn't worry about this too much. This is slightly advanced, but we will go through some examples of this in the future. Right. I think that covers this slide. All right, now trapping with suits. So when we get to the turn with a marginal strong hand, we can use suits if we want to decide our actions. So let's say we open Queen of Hearts, Jack of Clubs. The big blind defends. The board is Queen of Diamonds, 5 of Clubs, 6 of Hearts, so rainbow. We bet and he calls. The turn is a 9 of Hearts. Now, we don't need as much protection from Hearts now because we have a Heart blocker. So if we're close and we want to bet like some of our Queen Jacks, for example, or we don't think... For some people, Queen Jack might just be a bet, right? If they're fish or they're not check raising a lot on the turn and not very aggressive, then we just want to bet Queen Jack to maybe check back the river. But we can't really go for 3 streets of this hand anyway. We can versus some people, and if we can, go for it. But if you're going to try and mix some checks, which you don't have to do, you would want to use one of the Queen Jacks with a heart in it. And I think this is a really good way to do it. And you bet the ones where he's going to most likely still call worse. And then check back the ones where if the heart does come in and he does decide to stab, he's less likely to have a flush, and then we just clear a call. But when we do this, we're not doing it to bluff catch the river, even though we are trying to catch bluffs. We're trapping the turn to induce a bluff on the river. So when we talk about never bluff catching, when you do this kind of stuff, you still have to bluff catch. So these should be deliberate bluff catches, as opposed to like, maybe do this, maybe don't. Think about what you're doing, use your suits, and if you have any questions, let me know. Okay. So we touched a bit earlier, but essentially when we reopen the action, our street has gone check. We usually use a 33% size. Obviously, lots of exceptions. When we get to river in a check scenario, i.e. 2 streets have been check. So for example, you defend the big blind, just check back on the flop, you check back on the turn, and as the big blind, we want to lead. We generally want to go very small because, again, we talked about cap ranges and people checking back and being able to go very thin. It's just natural that sizes get smaller the more streets are checked, unless the board changes in some crazy way. Cool. So when the flop goes check as the big blind, we should be stabbing the turn very, very aggressively. So you defend the big blind, whoever checks back. Honestly, I've had students that have just done this 100% and then turned it down. It just makes a lot of money doing this. People aren't doing this enough. People just check back their weekends and just fold too many turns. Like, go for it. If it's close, just absolutely bet. Like, really push up this number. Obviously, then we can turn it down if you get too crazy. Use your brain. But yeah, for sure, go for it. Excuse me. It is the same situation when we're the out of position raiser and the flop goes check. So, for example, we open, button defends, we check the flop because we're out of position. We should check. On the turn, you want to stab pretty aggro. For sizing, you want to use your judgment. You've got with the 3 options you've got. So let's say the open 9s, the flop is 7-4-5, check. Obviously, would have been going for a check raise. Turns a 10, pretty clear. Block for a third to deny overs. Maybe a call base high, prevent him betting large into us and facing just causing problems for ourselves. If the turn's an ace and we have ace king and he's not going to fold an ace, just go big. Fairly simple. I think so. When betting the turn in this way, use the same rules as discussed earlier to figure out your river play. So you want to bluff, you want to have some natural folds. So natural folds are hands that would have always called and then folded. So for example, on 7-4-5-10, and you bluff the turn, and the river's a deuce, a natural fold you could have is 9-8, or maybe there was a flush draw, you'd have a missed flush draw. So you don't want to be good mental when he just always has a 10. You need to think about the kind of hands he is going to fold if you are bluffing. And again, on a brick, use your overbets if you are going to bluff. Okay, playing flush draws. Flush draws have a bunch of equity, but they aren't that good river bluff candidates because they block our opponent's folding range. Remember, we talked about suits. Suits are important. The worst spot in poker, and absolutely must be avoided at all costs, is getting in a draw versus a better draw. You always want to be the guy that has the best draw, right? You can't always avoid it, but that's what you should be aiming to do. And here's how you do it. So, you're the big blind versus the button. The board is 9-5 of hearts, 2 of clubs, and you have an ace flush draw. You should be raising a lot. Can he call worse? Yes, you can call all the worst flush draws. So you can value raise this hand. King Queen of hearts is a lot more dangerous because letting him always call with ace-x of hearts is a disaster. So if you're check raising with king, queen of hearts, because you're like, 2 overs, flush draw. And then he's just always calling with the nut flush draw. It's just literally burning money. And king, queen, I mean, there's an exception to every rule, obviously, but there's a big difference between these two hands. Pair plus flush draws are also really good because then if they do call with the nut flush draws, or you get it in against the nut flush draw, you're like, all right, great, I've got 3 2s of hearts, and I'm just going to hold with my pair, and whatever, we got 55%, run it. Doesn't bother me. It's the same concept with straight draws on flush draw boards. So if you're check raising a flush draw board with like a low straight draw, and the guy can just call you down twice with queen high flush draw and just win at showdown because you didn't triple because the board ran out badly. What a disaster that is. I mean, you do get, let's just read it. It's the same concept with straight draws on flush draw boards. Putting in the money when the guy can call down with ace high twice isn't a fun proposition, but these hands are better for blocking rivers to make him fold the flush draws. So there's a bit of give and take there, obviously. Don't get carried away on the turn. If you raise ace-x of hearts on the flop, he'll definitely call with the worst draw. If you start blasting it, he may fold his worst draw. So for example, if you check raise the flop with a nut flush draw, he definitely calls all his worst flush draws, 100%. The turn, if you bomb the turn and he starts folding all his worst flush draws, and only continues with hands that beat ace high, that's not good. So think about that in terms of EV and equity. We're folding all the hands that we beat, and we're getting to call all the hands that we don't beat. So regardless of whether you think, the only option left is check. So we've solved that one, check. Maybe you get a free card and stack his worst flushes. If you were going to bet, check call is still better because it might be cheaper and he may have checked back. So it's a free roll to see if you get a free river. And the times you do get a free river, if the flush does come in, he's, again, in Pyro World, if he's made his flush, he's supposed to raise if you lead the river, and you're probably going to lead for like a small sizing or whatever. And then you get to 3-bet and maybe get more money. So fantastic. So just think about what you're doing on the turn. Don't just mindlessly bet these things. So if you start blasting, you may fold it, and that narrows his range a lot. And when we get there, we want to get paid because he's now folded all his worst draws and only get paid now. So feel free to check call the turn. Once you do check raise, you may get a free card. You may even be able to double check raise because maybe he just goes small. You're like, oh, he fucking doesn't have anything good now. So maybe I've got fold equity. And if you don't, you get there. So always be using your brain. But always be thinking I can be called by a worse draw. Always be thinking when you raise, can I be called by worse? Don't get confused when you value raise the flop because you are with ace high flush draws, and then all of a sudden on the turn your hand isn't a value bet because things are always changing. So just bear all that in mind. A way to think about betting is thinking about it in terms of betting big or betting small. And the way to figure that out is to figure out whether you want to bluff on the next street. So with a flush draw on the turn, if you do want to bet it, you don't really want to be bluffing the river because as we spoke about, these are really bad hands to bluff the river. So you want to choose larger sizes. So sometimes even overbetting, and that's maybe as the aggressor in position, not necessarily after you check raise the flop. With a hand that can still bluff the river, you might want to choose a small sizing. Again, still follow your turn rules if it's a brick and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying that when you're in these stab positions, if you've got a flush draw and you're leading into someone on the turn, you might want to go bigger because you're not going to bluff the river. If you've got a straight draw that is going to bluff the river always, you might want to go small and then overbet the river because then you keep the range wide on the turn, so your bluffs work more on the river, whereas the other hand isn't going to bluff the river, and that will work out fine because all your pairs in between, like the ones that you want to block, are going to fill in for the straight draw ones, and the ones that are going to bet big regardless. So don't worry about balance and all that kind of crap. But let's continue. We have a hand that wants to bluff the river. Maybe choose a small sizing on the turn in order to maximize fold equity on the river. Yep. I would still mostly check raise nut flush draws in 3-bet pots. The same logic applies. Can be called by worse to have fold equity, but again, exceptions to every rule. Back to the flop. So we developed a strategy for 33% on the flop, and should start to give you some ideas of how to implement which sizes are used where. We can also have a flop overbetting strategy of say 110 to 150%. So have a little think. Why would you do that? And so the answer is when the equity and EV dictate that we can do this. And let's talk about when that works. But have a little think, when's a good time to do that? So in general, the flop if the flop is 10xx, 9xx with like no straights and no flushes possible, we can choose hands such as overpairs for overbets. And this makes a lot of sense. So for example, pocket jacks would be a great hand to overbet on this board. Because if we choose 33%, our opponent is still going to continue with all the overcards and backdoor flush draws, which have quite a decent amount of equity versus their hand. But if we overbet, they will continue with mainly hands that have already connected with the board. So it's fantastic because if you overbet jacks and he just calls you 10x and whatever the other pairs are x and maybe some whatevers, and folds like king queen, and king queen has more equity versus pocket jacks than 10x does. That's a fantastic result. So that's why overbet would be a good thing. So on 10xx we could 125% jack. Turns a king. Now when we start overbetting flops, we definitely can't just keep blasting off for large sizing, SPR and all that kind of stuff. So this is for me a pretty clear 33%. Still get called by his 10x, maybe some underpairs as well, maybe some straight draws. Probably let us know he's got a king now. And then on the turn, I should say river, right? River deuce, you can now size up again because once he doesn't check raise the turn, you should assume he doesn't have a king, and just value bet as you would versus a 10. Pick the sizing you want to choose. 3-betting the flop. This is something that people see me do on stream quite a bit. So again, every single decision we make all the time should have these two things you need to think about. Can I improve my hand and can I get called by worse? You should be really trying to get in the zone of thinking like this now. So let's give you an example. We open aces. The board is queen 9-5 with 2 hearts. We see bet 33 and get check raised. It's a pretty clear 3-bet. We can't improve our hand. Maybe we can a bit more. We have the ace of hearts, but he can still be check raising flush draws. Queen X, ace queen we already spoke about. 6-7, jack 10. Is he going to call them if we 3-bet? He's definitely calling his queen X. He's definitely calling some really strong flush draws. Is it going to create a dynamic where sometimes he goes away and you have to call? Absolutely, but we have to be prepared for that, and we have to figure out our opponents, and we have to play poker. And if he does just call, it doesn't mean like we go crazy now, but him just calling is a good sign. So turns a deuce, let's go. You know, some people will flat ace queen to get it in on a good turn. That's great. Turns a heart, then we probably don't have any flushes anymore. He should be doing some leading, but we'll talk about leading later. But yeah, obviously proceed with caution when you do start narrowing ranges, because I have to tell you, people don't really play very well versus 3-betting on the flop, and they tend to just be super condensed and really narrow. But for example, so ace is clearly a 3-bet here. Makes a lot of sense to 3-bet this hand. Queen jack, however, can improve, i.e. you can turn a 10, you can turn an 8, so it would just be a call. So again, can I improve my hand? Can I get called by worse? Aces, yes. Aces, you can't improve your hand. Yes, you can get called by worse. Queen jack, you can improve your hand. Maybe get called by worse, but it's a little bit more marginal. This should make relatively good sense. When to bluff with showdown. This is really good rule actually, that is a little bit flimsy but works really well. You'll find that you need to turn pairs into bluffs, but how do we figure out how to do that? The easiest way I found for doing this is something called the rule of 4. And this means for every pair better than your hand, you count that as 1. And if a straight is possible, that's also 1. And if a flush is possible, that's also 1. And this adds up to 4 or more, you turn your hand into a bluff. And you follow the same rules with sizing. So, we open the button. The flop is king 7-4. We see bet 33% with deuces. The turn's a queen. There are now 4 overcards bigger than ours. It's time to bluff. It's a brick. It's not an overcard brick. We bet 150%. And then most likely follow the same rule on the river. Don't forget the net ranges are narrow, so we want to find some natural folds. Sometimes if the turn brought a flush draw, he's going to always call here with like a pair plus flush draw. If that bricks, it's a fantastic spot to jam to make them fold. And obviously, you're following the same rule with all your sets as well, so you're not over bluffing. So you're all good. But yeah, be bluffing off with deuces here and 3s. Okay, we open the button. The flop is king 7-4. We get 33% with 4-5. The turn's a queen. This does not make rule of 4 because king 7 queen. There's only 3 overcards, so we do check back the turn. The river's a jack. Now there's a straight, but I wouldn't really count this straight in rule of 4 because I wouldn't expect too many ace 10s, but you know, it's pretty close. But even with just the overcards, king, queen, jack, 7, the rule of 4 now applies. So if he checks, obviously if he bets, we just fold. But if he checks, the rule of 4 is now, all right, time to bluff. So we reopen. We know we reopen for a third. And we're hoping he folds a hand like 7x, 8 through the 10s. So that should make sense. So this is how you use the rule of 4. Okay. The rule of 4, we'll talk more about that when we go through hand histories, but that was pretty quick, but it will make more sense as you use it. All right, so playing forward pots. Forward pots are fairly simple, given ranges are narrow, and pots are shallow. If we're the aggressor and want to essentially be C-betting range on all boards for about 25%, similar to how we play single raise pots, doing a lot of betting. If we're facing a C-bet and you have any reasonable equity, it's time to just jam and hope he folds or we get there. So you have ace queen suited, he 4-bets, you call. The flop is you have ace queen of diamonds. The flop is like 2 diamonds. You c-bets, go all in. If you think you got more fold equity by raising, do that, but put the money in, run the board. Also in spots where you peel hands like queen queen to a 4-bet and the flop 7 high, you know, what did you want? You were like, oh crap, queens might be dead, but I'll just hope for a good board. And you got a good board, it's time to put your money in. And obviously be deeper and versus, you know, you can find exceptions and try and figure out what your opponent's doing as well, but in general it's like, all right, good board, time to go. All right, playing the turn in 4-bet pots. Don't think because the SPR is stat to pot ratio is 1, we can't continue to bet small in these pots. So I'll give you an example. We open aces under the gun to 2x, button 3 bets to 8.5. We make it 22.5. They call. The pot is now 46.5 BBs. Then we got about 80 behind. Flop is 7 deuce 3. We bet 11.5, which is about a quarter. They call. The pot is 69.5. Stacks about 67 BBs. Turns is 6. I mean, we can trap aces here as well, so we can check to try and let him do something. But let's say we had kings or queens, we'd definitely be betting. Queens and jacks probably jam because it needs more protection. Aces would never jam. So we're going to bet. We're going to still be able to bet 25%. That keeps in all his worst pairs, which is fantastic. Also makes him a lot more committed by the river. Also, sometimes betting small and threatening the fact that you still have a barrel on the river scares people enough that it makes them quite large folds on the turn, which is great when you're bluffing, and you do the same things when you're bluffing. Like you probably barrel ace-5 on the turn here because you've got outs. Ace-5 suited might just jam because he wants to maximize fold equity if it has a flush draw, for example, on the turn. But yeah, you got to use your brain a little bit, but don't just think that you just have to jam. All right, let's talk about blind and blind. So as the small blind, we're going to play a raise only strategy. Rake is too high at most sites and stakes, and it's fine. The small blind is a one spot that we will be allowed to c-bet out of position, but if we choose to c-bet, we should be choosing a 23%, so very small sizing. It should be fairly intuitive which hands to c-bet. Hands that don't want to get folded off their equity or need protection, you know, and the odd dry bluff. So they're following all the same turn barrel rules as you would in all other spots. So example on 10-7-5, we should c-bet 10x for value. Probably c-bet queen jack, jack 8, jack 9, 6 8, check call 5x, check call 7x, check call ace queen, check call ace 8. Should make a reasonable amount of sense. And as the big blind versus the small blind, if we check to, we need to know whether a hand can face a raise. If it can, then you should always be betting. In general, as a good rule, if you can call a raise, you can bet, like in any spot. If it can't, then you need to choose between check and bet. So on 10-7-5, 9-8 and 6-8 can quite clearly call a raise. 10x can call a raise. Maybe even 3-bet versus a raise. Maybe check 7x and 5x, because these are pretty good hands to then call on the turn. And then hands like jack 8 can call a raise, especially with like backdoor flush draws because they have a nut shot. Ace X could be ahead. Doesn't quite know where it is if it bets, so pretty clear check. King Queen, again, has a lot of equity, doesn't want to get raised, so you check that back. Queen 8 is a good bluff. Queen 8 is a good bluff because it has some natural cards that it can barrel, such as a 9, a 6, a jack, and doesn't care if you get raised. You just get to fold. So that should make some sense. As a big blind playing versus a small blind c-bet, we do need to have some raises and start attacking a very wide range. So on 10-7-5, you wouldn't raise 9-8 because it can quite happily call twice. Jack 8 and Jack 9, on the other hand, could be good raises as they're ahead of hands that he can call us with, such as 9-8. And also they can turn the nuts, and it doesn't really matter if he 3-bets us because we just fold. We just got to gut shot. So we don't want to use every combo. So how do you do it? Should be obvious right now. You use your suits, and this is something I actually learned from Linus Love, and this concept is called double backdoor flush draw blockers. So let's explain double backdoor flush draw blockers. So the board is 10 of hearts, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades. You could use all your hands with actual backdoor flush draws, such as Jack 9 of hearts, Jack 9 of diamonds, Jack 9 of spades, as your raises, because then you can barrel off those suits. And again, your rainbow suits too. Don't forget your rainbows, because he's going to call his backdoor flush draws and you get to fold him off. But to use your offsuit combos, again, just do it when both suits match the board. So you've got Jack of hearts, 9 of diamonds, or Jack of diamonds, 9 of spades, etc. And then follow your turn barreling strategies. Again, if you 3-bets, easy fold, blast off on your right suits, and then blast off on your right rivers. Makes sense? And then sometimes get there. That happens sometimes. Okay, Long King the turn, another slightly more advanced concept, but essentially, where the turn is not a brick, there's an argument for the player that just called the flop to lead the turn. Donks are always for a third. Most common when the turn pairs the board or brings a flush. Use leading in these spots for value when your hand wants the lead, and we'll explain a bit more about that. 10-7-5, we defend Jack 8 and check call the flop. The turn's a 7. We lead because it pairs the board and we can lead. And if he bets, we can't call, but if we lead, he might fold. And if he raises us, we have an easy fold. So we have a pretty clear decision with Jack 8 if we lead the turn here. And we'll just follow the same rules on the river again, where if the river's a brick, we'll just overbet if he's got some natural folds. Don't lead hands like 10x or 5x, because if you raise, you're like, what do I do now? You can lead in a 3 part and 4 parts too, but we'll talk about more about that in some more advanced videos. But yeah, don't. Also, when you're playing versus a lead, you've got to do the same thing again. Can I improve my hand or not? So, for example, if someone leads and you've got ace 10 on 10-7-5 turn 7, and the guy leads the turn, you have to raise. You have to raise very big. You can fold to a 3-bet, but if you're just letting him realize his equity with Jack 8, which is what you're trying to do, and you get to like pay your own price on the turn versus the 7 that doesn't 3-bet, it's clearly a raise. And just trust me, if you can't improve your hand, raise or fold. Ace 10 doesn't want to fold, clearly a raise. All right. So how do we start thinking about equity? So break down your opponent's range into 2 sections. Either it's a good hand or it's a bluff. Now, this is just very conceptually. Now, think about how your hand does versus bluffs and think about how it does versus value. And in general, you'll find your strong hands and high equity hands do the same versus bluffs, i.e. they both beat the same bluffs. Like we spoke about earlier, I think it was the first video. 7s and 6-5 on Queen 10-5. 6-5 does better, has more equity versus value, and they beat the same bluffs. So the hand strength becomes irrelevant, but the higher equity hands do better versus value. So they just become the best hands to use. And once you figure this out, you'll generate a lot more EV and spot a lot more opportunities to take advantage of that your opponent wouldn't, that we might even yet have thought of, but you just need to start thinking in this way. Okay, here's another anecdote, which is really important. Poker is actually not about winning. It's about not losing and let people make the mistakes. Like, I've seen so many samples of so many really good players where they're just winning at like 2 big blinds and they should be winning. They're like, why do I not win more? And they're very, very good. But this punt, they're getting themselves into fancy play syndrome. And like poker, a bit of a reality check here is boring. You have to sit there and just play good, not care about your results. All you should care about when you're playing poker for the next few weeks is doing everything we've said in this framework and just following it and trying to figure it out and trying to learn it and trying to understand it in terms of EV and equity and making sure you're doing that all properly. And then once you've got your head around it, just doing it and just playing good and checking back with us. It's a game we think we're playing against other people. We're just sitting there and playing against ourselves. If that guy over bluffs and you just fold too much, doesn't matter. We don't bluff catch. It's fine. Let him do it. Doesn't matter. Or he could have this. Doesn't matter. We've already established that the guy needs to be over bluffing, and they're not doing that. Don't blow off. Don't level yourself. The boring players are the ones that always have the biggest win rates, I guarantee you. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all your biggest losing pots of the session. There should only be coolers. For example, I've had a student now called Morris that I've been teaching for 2-3 years. And when we first started going through his hands, if I had like a batch of 50 hands, it would take us hours. I'd be like, what were you doing here? What were you thinking here? And now he gives me a batch of 50 hands. 40 of them will just be like, all right, you had to do that. And then 10 of them were like, well, pretty close. Well, let's say 5 of them pretty close. And maybe 5 of them were leaning towards it, but maybe he had a read and we talk about it a bit more. But the point is that takes me like 20 minutes. Whereas before it would take me hours. And that's how it should eventually, at the end of this, that's what it'd be the same with you. Don't punt and let the money come to you. That's all you should be doing. Right. Lastly, don't bluff catch. Bet if you can get called by worse. Bet the sizing that gets called by worse. Think about whether you can improve your hand. Use suits. Don't punt. And never stop playing poker. Right. That is the end of the slides. I appreciate there's a lot of information in there. Rewatch it if you want to. If you've got any questions, don't send them straight away. Think about it for a few days. Maybe write them down. And then I'll ask you all for your questions and we'll go from there. All the best.